Why does nobody talk about Cape Verde? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the only question worth asking about one of the most historically significant places on the planet. A group of islands that helped build the modern world, that sat at the center of global trade for 4 centuries, that produced a music so unique the United Nations declared it part of humanity's cultural heritage. And yet most people cannot find it on a map. That ends today. Here is the question that should stop you cold. How does a group of islands that were completely uninhabited when Europeans arrived in 1456 become, within a single century, one of the most strategically important locations on the entire planet? And how does that same place, after sitting at the center of Atlantic history for 400 years, end up somewhere most educated people have never thought about for a single second? Those two facts should not be able to coexist, but they do. And the answer to why they do tells you something profound not just about Cape Verde, but about how the world decides which stories get told, which ones get preserved, and which ones are quietly left behind. When Portuguese explorers landed on these islands in 1456, they found nothing. No people, no civilization, no evidence that any human being had ever set foot there. What they also found was something far more valuable than they initially understood. They found position. Cape Verde sits approximately 570 kilometers off the west coast of Africa near Senegal, directly in the path of the Atlantic trade winds. In the age of sail, that location was not just convenient, it was everything. If you were a ship leaving Europe heading to the Americas, or leaving the Americas heading to Africa, or leaving Africa heading anywhere, Cape Verde was where you stopped. In 1462, 6 years after discovery, the Portuguese founded a settlement on the island of Santiago called Ribeira Grande. It was the first permanent European settlement ever built in the tropics, anywhere on Earth. It still stands today, now called Cidade Velha, and in 2009 UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site. You can walk its original streets right now. You can stand in the main square next to a marble pillar erected in 1520, still intact, and try to comprehend what happened there. Within decades, these empty volcanic islands had become the beating heart of Atlantic commerce. But here is where you need to understand something. Because what was being traded through Ribeira Grande was not just spices and textiles and timber. At its peak, approximately 3,000 enslaved people per year passed through Cape Verde on their way to the Americas. The Portuguese granted Santiago's residents exclusive rights to the slave trade along the entire Guinea coast in 1466. Just 4 years after the first settlement was founded, Ribeira Grande became the primary clearinghouse for human beings being shipped to plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. Enslaved people were brought here to be, in the language of the era, seasoned, taught basic Portuguese, sometimes baptized, because that made them worth more at market. That marble pillar in the main square, that was where enslaved people were publicly punished or displayed for sale. Cape Verde was the center of this trade for more than 300 years. And out of that history, out of that collision of Portuguese colonists, West African captives, Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition, Genoese adventurers, and reprieved convicts, something no one planned emerged. A culture, a language, a music, an identity. But to understand what was built here, you first need to understand what the islands had to survive. 3 major droughts struck Cape Verde between the 18th and 19th centuries. Over 100,000 people starved to death. Forests had been stripped. The ground had lost the moisture that held it together. Famine became the island's most reliable visitor. Between 1900 and 1970, the Portuguese colonial government forcibly shipped 80,000 Cape Verdeans to plantation labor in São Tomé and Príncipe. Not as free workers, as contract labor, which was, in practice, slavery by another name. A people who had already survived the trade in human beings were now being traded themselves. And yet, the culture did not collapse, it deepened. What emerged from those centuries of suffering was morna, a genre of music so specific to Cape Verde that there is no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. The word Cape Verdans use for the feeling at the heart of morna is sodade. It is not quite sadness, it is not quite longing. It is the specific ache of loving something across an impossible distance. A home you cannot return to. A person you cannot reach. A life just beyond the horizon. For centuries, morna was sung in the bars and harbors of Mindelo. It traveled no further than the islands themselves. Then one woman carried it to the world. Cesária Évora was born in 1941 in Mindelo, on the island of São Vicente. She began singing in the sailors' bars of the port city at the age of 16. She received no pay, just free drinks. She sang in Creole, the Creole language of Cape Verde, to audiences of fishermen and sailors who had heard those songs their entire lives. For decades, she remained almost entirely unknown outside the islands. She was 47 years old when a concert promoter heard her voice in a Lisbon restaurant and understood immediately that he was listening to something that had no category in the rest of the world. She went to Paris, she recorded, she toured. In 1992, her album Miss Perfumado sold 300,000 copies worldwide. In 2004, she won the Grammy Award for Best Contemporary World Music Album. She performed barefoot for her entire career, simply because it was her comfort, and it became her trademark. Cesária Évora did not find the world. The world eventually found her. And when it did, it found Cape Verde through her voice. She died in 2011. Cape Verde declared 2 days of national mourning. The airport in Mindelo was renamed after her. Her face was printed on the national currency, a barefoot singer from a port city that most of the world had never heard of. But there is something you need to understand about Cape Verde that no travel brochure will tell you clearly. These 10 islands are not one place. They are 10 completely different worlds sharing the same passport. Santiago, the largest island, is where the capital Praia sits. Urban, layered with history. The kind of city where 16th century colonial architecture and vibrant street markets exist half a block apart. This is the island where Cidade Velha stands, where it all began. Fogo is dominated by Pico do Fogo, an active volcano rising 2,829 meters above sea level, the highest point in Cape Verde. Inside its caldera, at an altitude of 1,600 meters, sit the villages of Portela and Bangueira. Those villages were completely buried by lava in 1995, then rebuilt. Buried again in 2014, then rebuilt again. The residents of Chandas Caldeiras have never considered leaving. The volcanic soil produces wine, unlike anything grown anywhere else on Earth. This land is the only land their families have ever known. They will not leave it for a volcano. Santo Antão has valleys so green, so dramatically lush on an island of volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic, that hikers fly in from across Europe specifically to walk its ribeiras, the river valley trails that cut through mountains above the clouds. Sal and Boa Vista are the beach islands, the resort islands. The ones most people picture when someone says the words Cape Verde, and they are genuinely beautiful, but they are the opening credits of a much longer film. Cape Verde became independent on July 5, 1975. Before that, it was a Portuguese colony for 513 years. 5 centuries of colonial rule on a group of islands that had no indigenous population, which means that everything here, every tradition, every dish, every word in Creole, every chord in a morna, every stone in Cidade Velha was built from nothing by people who arrived with nothing, or were brought here against their will with nothing. That is not a tragedy dressed up as a destination. That is one of the most remarkable acts of collective cultural creation in modern history. A people who shared no origin, no common language, no single homeland, built one from scratch. On volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 570 kilometers from the nearest continent. And what they built is extraordinary. If you are a traveler who has been to the same destinations, who has felt the same curated experiences designed to confirm what you already expect, who has started to wonder whether travel can still genuinely surprise you, Cape Verde is the answer to that question. If you are a history lover who thought the story of the Atlantic world was already fully written, Cape Verde is the chapter that was deliberately left out of your edition. And if you are someone who has never heard of Cesária Évora, never stood in the square at Cidade Velha next to that marble pillar, never watched the sun set behind Pico de Fogo from inside the caldera of a living volcano, never tasted cachupa, the national dish, a slow-cooked stew of corn and beans and whatever the sea gave you that day, that tastes like someone invented it specifically to make homesickness feel like warmth. You are not behind. You are just about to catch up. The thumbnail that brought you here asked one question: Why does nobody talk about Cape Verde? Now you know the answer. They do. They always have. On the docks of Ribeira Grande in 1480, in the sailors' bars of Mindelo in 1965, in a concert hall in Paris in 1992, when a barefoot woman from an island most of the audience had never heard of made an entire room feel something they had no word for. Cape Verde was never hidden. The world just hadn't caught up yet. Now you have.